Brandon Mitchell stood frozen in the first-class cabin, the warm yellow lights casting sharp shadows across a face carved from fury and disappointment, while the command he had just delivered still hung in the dense air like a blade suspended mid-fall. "All of you are fired." A moment that looked still from the outside, but cracked through the cabin like thunder exploding across a clear sky. Passengers stiffened. The crew went silent. And even those who had looked at Brandon as someone who didn't belong felt something rupture, an invisible line being torn apart. But to understand that moment, the moment a CEO became a storm capable of shaking an entire airline industry, we must go back just minutes earlier, when the pain he had carried his entire life finally ignited. Brandon, 39 years old, a black CEO of Orion Systems, one of the largest cybersecurity companies in America, was seated in Seat 2A, the seat he had booked days in advance. He wore a dark grey tailored suit, the kind of fine material that caught the cabin light like the quiet armor of a man who had walked through hell and climbed back out on his own. But beneath that calm exterior beat the heart of a boy from West Baltimore, where a single misstep could send a life spiraling into the void. And that heart trembled just slightly when the lead flight attendant, Kelsey Browning, looked at him with a cold, dismissive gaze and placed in front of him nothing more than a cheap plastic cup of water, while the white passengers around him were being poured sparkling champagne into crystal glassware. Brandon did not react. He was used to this, far too used to it. From being the student whose raised hand was ignored because he did not look like someone who understood the lesson, to being the MIT undergrad whose professor doubted his work because it was too good for someone from your background, he had learned to smile, to swallow it, to let success answer for him. But today was not like those days. Today the insult stood in front of him, unmistakable deliberate breathing, and its name was Gerald Whitmore. Gerald, 62 years old, boarded the plane like the entire first-class cabin was his private living room, a place where everyone else should make way. The moment he saw Brandon sitting in Seat 2A, he stopped his face, tightening, with the disgust of someone seeing a sacred privilege being violated. "That's my seat, Gerald," said his voice, dripping with entitlement, not because the system listed it that way, but because he had sat there for years and believed the seat belonged to him by virtue of his existence. No courtesy, no question, only command. Brandon looked up, his voice steady, quiet, firm. "I booked this seat." Gerald let out a laugh, thick with contempt. "You in that seat, from behind." Kelsey rushed over, as if she had just been handed a chance to assert her power. "Mr. Whitmore, there must be a mistake. We will fix it immediately." Brandon met her eyes and said, "There is no mistake. This is my seat." But Kelsey was no longer listening. Neither was Gerald. And then Captain Martin Hale appeared, wearing the expression of a man who had already chosen a side before hearing a single word. "Sir," he said to Brandon with a tone overflowing with authority, but empty of respect, "we need you to move to another seat. This will help the flight run more smoothly." Smooth for whom? For the powerful white passenger, or for a flight crew desperate to avoid inconvenience by sacrificing the person they valued least? Brandon's heartbeat tightened. His anger did not blaze like fire, it froze like ice, sharp and cutting. He thought of his mother, who worked double shifts, yet still placed her warm hand on his shoulder, and said, "You do not bow your head. Not to anyone." But today, in the enclosed world of the first-class cabin, Brandon heard more than his mother's voice. He heard every voice of those who had been pushed to the back rows, those told to stay quiet so they would not cause trouble, those asked to give up their seat for someone more important, simply because of the color of their skin. Then came the breaking point. 2 air marshals appeared, armed, cold. They stood blocking the aisle as if preparing to remove a dangerous criminal. All of this because of a seat. The air tightened like a string, pulled to the point of snapping. A passenger whispered, "Why call the police?" Another replied, "He must have done something wrong." And in Brandon's eyes, the pain was no longer for himself. It was for everyone who had ever been judged simply for existing. He rose slowly, every muscle fighting to hold on to the last threads of calm. "I will go," he said, his voice low, his eyes burning. He walked past the stares, the pity, the avoidance, the curiosity, the people who saw the injustice but stayed silent, the people who believed Gerald's smirk of victory. He walked to seat 18B, where his legs cramped, where the air felt heavier, where the world seemed to shrink around him, pressing on his chest. But none of them knew. Not one person in that cabin knew that the man they shoved out of first class owned 31% of the parent company that controlled this airline. That the storm they had awakened would not end with hurting a single passenger. It would tear an entire system apart. And when Brandon stared at the wall in front of him, his eyes no longer trembled. Only one thing remained: determination. He whispered to himself like an oath, they chose the wrong man. And in that moment, though the cabin seemed quiet and unchanged, a far greater battle had begun. Brandon Mitchell, the boy, once dismissed the man who rose through every barrier, had stepped into a war to dismantle injustice at its core. The flight continued, but the fate of many lives had already begun to shift. Brandon Mitchell never forgot the cold that seeped through the thin brick walls of the small apartment in West Baltimore, nor the smell of engine oil that clung to his mother's jacket after every shift at the repair shop. On the nights she came home, hands trembling from exhaustion, yet still placing her warm palm against his cheek, she would speak in a voice soft as mist. "You have to get out of here, Brandon. You have to go farther than me, farther than anything they think you can be." That sentence lit the very first flame inside the heart of a black boy with bright eyes who was constantly underestimated. Outside the window, sirens and arguments from neighboring families created the familiar soundtrack of their struggling neighborhood. But inside his cramped room, Brandon saw a different world. A world powered by lines of code. He would take apart discarded computers he scavenged from the junkyard, clean every chip reconnect wires that had been severed long ago. His mother once asked, "Why do you bother with that? It does not even turn on." Brandon just smiled, his eyes glowing. "I want to know how it works." No one knew that this boy was building the foundation for the future of a tech billionaire. But dreaming big in a small world always comes with a price. When Brandon entered high school, teachers seldom noticed him unless they were suspicious. If his assignments were too good, they asked if he was sure he did them himself. When he said he wanted to apply to MIT, they laughed. No one from here has even gotten into the state college, but 3 people always believed in him: his mother, Brandon, and Brandon himself. Each time he was doubted, he buried himself in new programming languages, experimented with algorithms, tackled problems far beyond his grade level. He never argued. He let results speak for him. And those results arrived on a spring afternoon when an envelope with the MIT logo showed up in their rusted mailbox. His mother cried so hard he had to hold her up so she would not collapse. A full 4-year scholarship, a ticket out of a place where most black lives were channeled into 3 paths: poverty prison or disappearance. But MIT was not a paradise. It was cold in a different way. Cold in the polished glass hallways where wealthy students compared European vacations, cold in the judging eyes of professors when Brandon took a seat in the front row, cold in the murmurs behind him, saying he only got in because of diversity policies. Brandon did not respond, but each word felt like a nail driven into his chest. Winter nights he stayed in the library until 3 or 4 in the morning, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to himself that he belonged. One day his algorithms professor called him to the office. The man stared at Brandon's exam in silence, then said, "These solutions are too perfect. I need to know whether you truly did this or had help." Brandon paused, not because he lacked an answer, but because he did not know how to answer in a way that could erase the bias in that stare. Finally, he said, "Professor, the only one who taught me to program is the junkyard in my neighborhood." The professor did not laugh or nod. He simply wrote something on a sheet of paper. Brandon walked out with fists clenched, his heart bruised. But that night, he rewrote the entire set of solutions, adding 3 new optimizations. The next week, the professor summoned him again, only to say, "I have no more doubts." 4 years passed, and Brandon graduated valedictorian, both in computer science and business management. His peers headed to Google, Amazon, or major investment firms. Brandon returned to his mother's old garage, set a laptop on a broken table, propped up with bricks, and began building Orion systems. Neighbors shook their heads. Relatives said he was crazy. But Brandon believed what his mother taught him. The greatest things often begin in the worst places. Orion nearly went bankrupt 7 times in its first 3 years. Brandon ate instant noodles until he could recite every flavor. But he persisted. He built cybersecurity software with an unshakable belief that one day the world would notice. And the world did. First small and mid-sized companies bought Orion's products. Then larger organizations. Then government agencies. Each time he closed a deal, Brandon called his mother. Once she cried and said, "I knew you would do it." I always knew. But success never erased the memories, the stares that lingered too long when he walked into conference rooms, the raised brows questioning whether he belonged, the subtle jabs like, "Are you sure you are the right fit for this role?" Those moments formed a thin layer of scar tissue, buried deep, but always present. So when Kelsey placed that plastic cup of water in front of him, when Gerald looked at him as if he had taken a seat reserved for their world, when Captain Martin Hale forced him out of the seat he had paid for, that scar was struck. The pain was not from the moment itself. It was from hundreds, thousands of moments before it all resurfacing at once. And as Brandon walked toward seat 18B, through the whispers of passengers, through the skewed glances of those who saw him as the troublemaker, he remembered his mother's words. "You do not bow your head, even when they try to make you." In that moment, packed tightly in the narrow cabin where he was pushed out of a place he deserved, Brandon understood that the circle of fate had turned back to him. He was no longer the poor boy cornered by circumstance, no longer the student doubted by professors, no longer the young entrepreneur underestimated in boardrooms. He was Brandon Mitchell, the man who owned 31% of CoStar's parent company, a man powerful enough to change an entire system. And in the dimness of seat 18B, where everything seemed to be collapsing, a different fire ignited inside him, bigger and fiercer. A fire that would burn through every injustice rooted in the world he was about to confront. That morning, before the sun could break through Chicago's gray clouds, Brandon Mitchell stood before the glass walls of Orion Systems on the 46th floor, looking down at a city still half asleep. Today was the most important day in the 15 years he had spent building the company from his mother's old garage. A cybersecurity contract worth $4.3 billion with the Department of Homeland Security was not just a financial victory, it was a declaration that a black boy from West Baltimore could stand shoulder to shoulder with and even surpass the giants of Silicon Valley. Beside him, Alicia Monroe, his COO, and the person who had walked through the harshest years with him, handed him a cup of hot coffee. "Brandon, we have to leave now if we do not want to be late for the preparation meeting this afternoon." He nodded, offering a quiet but meaningful smile, one of the rare ones since the incident on the flight the week before during a business conference. No one knew about it except Alicia. "New York, here we come," he said. But neither of them knew that the plane Brandon was about to board would test him in the most brutal and unjust way imaginable. O'Hare Airport was more crowded than usual that afternoon. Passengers gathered shoulder to shoulder at Gate B-17, where Coast Air Flight 227 was preparing to depart. Large screens flashed the words "boarding soon," while the speakers repeated boarding instructions on a loop. Brandon arrived in a custom-tailored dark gray Tom Ford suit, confident but humble. He had never been one to boast. Even as a billionaire, he preferred blending into the crowd, listening to the world move, so he would never forget where he came from. Everything went smoothly until the young gate agent with bright eyes recognized him. "Mr. Mitchell, it is an honor to serve you. I just saw the news this morning." "Congratulations on the contract," Brandon offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, but please just call me Brandon." Not everyone was that polite. As Brandon stepped onto the aircraft, he felt the glances brushing over him, quick looks, followed by quick avoidance, long enough for him to recognize something he had known his whole life. Surprise tinged with doubt. Him in first class. Probably upgraded. The whispers were silent, but he heard them in the way people refuse to meet his eyes. At the aircraft door, lead flight attendant Kelsey Browning stood waiting. Her smile was so thin it was almost invisible. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said stiffly, then instantly turned to the white passenger behind him with a bright, glowing smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. It is a pleasure to serve you today." Brandon felt the contrast, clearly a familiarity so exhausting he no longer had room to react. He walked to seat 2A, the seat he chose because it gave him space to think. He placed his leather bag down, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the presentation for the signing ceremony. The first few minutes passed uneventfully. Then an unusual commotion rose from the cabin entrance. A grumbling male voice snapped, "I always sit in 2A. For 6 years. Why is someone else there today?" Brandon looked up, and that was the first time he saw Gerald Whitmore, the man he would later describe as the embodiment of privilege and blindness. Gerald wore an expensive but wrinkled suit, his silver hair cropped short, his eyes trained in entitlement, in the expectation of service, in the habit of being prioritized. Kelsey rushed toward him, her voice dripping with flattery. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sure there has been a mistake. Let me handle it." Gerald glanced at Brandon, as though he were an out-of-place object in a world he believed belonged solely to him. "He is in my seat. Brandon calmly replied, "I booked this seat." Gerald scoffed, "You booked it. This seat." His voice carried loudly enough that several passengers turned to watch. Some frowned with discomfort, others leaned in with curiosity, as if awaiting the next act of a theater performance. Brandon felt the shift in the atmosphere. Crew members moved more quickly, exchanging glances, whispering in corners. Then Captain Martin Hale appeared, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed he could decide anyone's fate on his plane. "Sir," he said to Brandon, "we need to move you to economy." Only one sentence, but it cut with the sharpness of calculated humiliation. Brandon met his eyes. "I paid for this seat. I arrived on time. There is no valid reason for me to be removed." Kelsey cut in her tone, edged with irritation. "You are delaying the entire flight. We are asking you to cooperate." Gerald added, his voice dripping with triumph. "Or do you think you are too special to give up one seat?" That was when Brandon understood this was no longer about seating. This was about them not wanting him in a place they believed belonged only to a particular kind of person. Moments later, 2 air marshals stepped onto the aircraft. All this over a seat. All because the man sitting there did not match their image of who belongs in first class. Brandon wanted to protest, to say he had every right. But he also knew a harsher truth. A black man surrounded by armed officers is never in a safe situation. Not for him. Not for anyone who looks like him. An old fear, one he thought success had buried, clawed its way back. It was not fear of them. It was fear of what they could do without consequence. Alicia rose from the cabin behind him, but a crew member blocked her. "Ma'am, please take your seat." Brandon shook his head, gently signaling her not to intervene. When he stood up, the air shifted. Gerald smiled in victory. A nearby flight attendant whispered, "I knew it." And Brandon, the man who had signed national security contracts, who had spoken on TEDx stages about equality, who had broken through barriers with his own intellect, now had to walk to seat 18B like someone being punished. But sometimes fate simply wants to see how much a person can endure before they rise and change everything. Brandon did not know that behind him, several passengers were live-streaming the incident. He did not know that from the back cabin, a young flight attendant named Tiana was watching with eyes full of guilt. He did not know that each step he took down the narrow aisle was etching itself into the memories of those witnessing it, a story they would retell for years. And Brandon didn't know that outside the window, the grey clouds were holding the storm he was about to unleash on the world. Because sometimes things must break completely before they can be rebuilt the right way. And on that day, 30,000 feet in the air, that breaking had already begun. Seat 18. B was so cramped that Brandon's knees touched the back of the seat in front of him, and every slight movement from the large man in 18A pressed him sideways. Yet that physical discomfort was still easier to bear than the shrinking of dignity he had just endured. The entire cabin felt suffocating, not because of the air, but because of the sideways glances, the whispered comments that were quiet, but painfully clear. He really got pulled from first class, probably caused trouble. He does not look like someone with money. Small sentences, sharp as needles, pricking at Brandon's skin. Not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Too familiar. Familiar in the way his life story was often written by people who knew nothing about him except the color of his skin. But among all those looks, there was one pair of eyes, unlike any other, the eyes of Tiana Brooks. the young flight attendant who had just brought the service cart to Brandon's row. When their eyes met, she leaned slightly as if shielding him from the camera's view. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered, but it was the note she placed on his tray that sent a cold shock down his spine. "This has happened many times, not just to you, to any black passenger sitting in first class." Brandon read the tiny paper again and again, each word striking the anger he had been trying to control since the moment he stepped onto the plane. Tiana continued whispering while pretending to pour water. "They call first class the white section. And if any black passenger sits there, they find a way to move them." Brandon felt a chill run down his back, not the kind of chill that comes from fear, but the sharp, cutting cold that forms when the truth is too cruel to absorb at once. He looked at Tiana, her eyes filled with worry but also courage. "Why are you telling me this?" Brandon murmured. "Because if you stay silent today, like the ones before you, they will never stop." Tiana stepped away quickly, leaving Brandon with a wave of emotion rising violently beneath the calm surface he was trying to maintain. The plane was already on the runway, the pilot announcing takeoff, but Brandon barely registered the familiar rumble of the engines. His mind was on what this represented, not only on this plane, but on thousands of flights, tens of thousands of moments, where people who suffered injustice stayed quiet because they thought they could not change anything. "But I can." Brandon clenched the small note in his palm, the words echoing in his mind, not as arrogance, but as responsibility. He opened his phone and used the offline messaging feature. To Alicia, find the ownership structure of Coast Air, now. Only minutes later, Alicia replied, "Parent company is Blue Sky Holdings. You own 31% through Orion Capital." Brandon leaned back against the seat. A smile appeared, but not a happy one. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he was the key the system never anticipated. Meanwhile, several rows ahead, Gerald Whitmore enjoyed his champagne and talked loudly about how people need to know their place sometimes. Laughter followed, feeding the flames further. Brandon did not look at him, but he heard every word. And at the front of the cabin, lead attendant Kelsey walked back and forth, her lips curled in self-satisfaction, convinced everything had been handled flawlessly. She had no idea that only a few meters behind her, the man she and the crew had humiliated was preparing to shake the entire airline industry. When the plane leveled off at 30,000 feet, Brandon began writing down every detail. How they approached him, how they threatened him, how air marshals were summoned with no legitimate cause. These small pieces of evidence might seem insignificant, but in the hands of Brandon, a man who built Orion systems from nothing, they were puzzle pieces of a massive picture. A picture that would force Coast Air to confront a truth they had buried for years. Moments later, Tiana discreetly placed another note on his tray. Not just this flight, 18 complaints in 10 months, all buried by management. Brandon closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. From deep within memory, his mother's voice resurfaced. "You do not bow your head before injustice, not because you are special, but because behind you are people weaker than you who cannot stand up for themselves." When the meal service began, flight attendants passed by, still avoiding Brandon's gaze, yet smiling at the white men in first class as if they were royalty. Gerald's voice rose again. "It is just a seat. I do not understand why those people make everything complicated." And Brandon understood. For Gerald, it truly was just a seat. But for Brandon, and for millions like him, It was the invisible line society used to decide who belongs and who does not. The difference between privilege and dignity. Minutes passed heavily, but inside Brandon, one thing had become clear: he would not let this disappear like the countless incidents before it. He would not allow his name to become another line in a list of people mistreated but silent out of fear. A notification from Alicia popped up on his screen. "Do you want me to arrange an emergency meeting after landing?" Brandon replied, "Yes. Gather the entire legal and communications team." "This is not just a customer complaint." "Then what is it?" Alicia asked. Brandon looked out the window where the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in deep amber, a sky that looked like a burning battlefield. It is the beginning of a reform. In that moment, the years of restraint within Brandon no longer felt like a burden. They became fuel, they became a weapon, and high above the world where people believed everything was small and unseen, Brandon decided to do what so many before him could not: drag the curtain of injustice into the light. The aircraft continued its journey, but silence was no longer a shield. Silence had become the enemy, and that enemy was about to be dismantled, down to its roots. As Coast Air Flight 227 began its descent, the familiar hum of the engines blended with the quiet tension hanging in the cabin, as if even the sky was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Brandon Mitchell sat still in seat 18B, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed ahead, while his mind pieced together the final fragments of a puzzle that had just clicked into place. Tiana Brooks had passed by moments earlier, careful not to look at him too long, but in the brief instant their eyes met, he saw both fear and resolve trembling inside her. A part of him wanted to stand up, right then walk back to first class, confront Gerald Kelsey, Captain Martin Hale, and every dismissive stare they had thrown at him. But the larger, sharper voice of reason whispered, "Not now. Not when they hold the power to put you at risk. Let everything happen on the ground where the law belongs to you." When the plane touched down, the cabin responded with a soft, collective exhale. A perfect landing. Yet Brandon knew perfection was the only thing Captain Hale possessed. Morality and fairness had long fallen off his control panel. The announcement chimed through the speakers. "Welcome to New York. Please remain seated." Brandon didn't hear the rest. His phone had been vibrating non-stop since the moment the aircraft descended. A message from Alicia legal team ready. PR on standby. Ownership documents prepared. Meeting arranged as soon as you exit the airport. Brandon replied, "Meet at gate C5 in 10 minutes. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin came alive. Passengers stood pulling luggage, chatting. A group of teenagers live-streamed on TikTok, whispering, "That is him, the guy kicked out of first class. The clip is going viral." Gerald Whitmore emerged from seat 2, as if reclaiming a throne, adjusting his tie, patting the corners of his mouth with a napkin, before laughing with a flight attendant. Finally handled that little issue. First class must remain at its proper standard. Brandon heard every word, each one slicing across a wound that was still raw. But he did not react. Not because he was weak, but because he knew what Gerald did not. Today was not a victory. Today was the beginning of his downfall. When Brandon's row finally stood, Tiana bent down, pretending to pick up a tray, and whispered, "I will wait for you at the gate. There is something you need to see." Brandon gave a slight nod. In her eyes, he saw fear blended with hope, the hope that he might be the one strong enough to finally break the chain of discrimination she and so many others had endured. Passengers streamed off the aircraft. Brandon walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but to observe. Captain Hale stood at the exit, his face shifting between surprise and unease when he saw Brandon. He must have assumed Brandon would disappear, like countless others who had been mistreated and forced into silence. Brandon stopped, met his eyes, and said in a low, steady tone that cut like a blade, "We will be seeing each other again very soon." The certainty in his voice made the captain freeze his mouth, opening slightly with no words forming. Brandon moved on, leaving a ripple of confusion spreading across the faces of the cabin crew. When he reached Gate C5, Alicia was there with the legal team, 2 people carrying document cases, and a tablet displaying ownership data. "Brandon, are you all right?" Alicia asked. "No," Brandon answered plainly. "But I will be once justice is served." Alicia handed him a folder. "Here is the ownership structure of Blue Sky Holdings. You are the largest individual shareholder. You have the authority to call an emergency board meeting." Brandon flipped through the pages, his eyes sharpening like steel meeting flame. "Good. We will use every ounce of power available to us." At that moment, Tiana approached from the far side of the gate, holding her personal tablet against her chest. She stood beside Brandon, not too close, cautious of being noticed. I have something you need to hear." She opened the tablet and played an audio recording. Captain Hale's voice emerged unmistakable, infuriatingly clear. "Attention everyone before today's flight. We had a passenger who does not fit the first-class image, so use your discretion and handle it properly. Do not let it affect the experience of our regulars." Then came Kelsey's voice, speaking to Ryan Bishop. "I do not like those types up in first class. If they want to sit there, they should earn it. Guests like Mr. Whitmore are the ones who belong." Brandon felt heat surge up his throat. This was no longer casual bias or isolated discrimination. This was a covert policy, perhaps even a culture, a toxic mindset nurtured by authority and silence. "Besides me, 3 other crew members are ready to provide evidence," Tiana said softly, voice trembling. "But they are terrified of losing their jobs." Brandon looked directly at her. "You will not lose your job. None of you will. I will make sure of that." It was more than reassurance. It was a vow. A fire ignited by the humiliation he suffered, and the bravery shown by people like Tiana. Alicia stepped forward. "Brandon, we need to leave now. The board is assembling as you requested." Brandon inhaled slowly, feeling the storm inside his chest solidify into something unbreakable. "Good," he said. "Let the meeting begin." As they made their way toward the exit, Brandon's phone vibrated non-stop. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. The video of him being removed from first class was spreading rapidly. Captions from passengers flashed. They were wrong. Unbelievable that this still happens today. He did nothing. They moved him because of his skin color. Brandon did not smile. He took no pleasure in going viral. But he understood one thing clearly: this wave of attention was the perfect opening strike. And as the automatic doors slid apart and the cold New York wind hit his face, Brandon Mitchell, once the underestimated boy, now the man humiliated, before a plane full of strangers, stepped out not to seek revenge, but to dismantle a system rotting from within. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was no longer an incident. This was Judgment Day, a day they were not prepared for. But he was. The New York sky that night was stained with a cold steel hue. Rain hammering against the glass windows of the Grand Meridian Hotel like a warning rhythm announcing a storm forming elsewhere, not outside, but in the 32nd floor conference room where Brandon Mitchell and his team were preparing for a historic confrontation. The room was spacious, yet the air inside felt tightly compressed, stretched thin by the tension coiled within it. The long table was covered in laptops, documents and legal drafts assembled with a speed that surprised even the people who had created them. Alicia Monroe stood at the head of the table, pointing toward the large screen that displayed the power structure of Blue Sky Holdings and Coast Air. "Brandon, you are not just the largest shareholder," she said. "You have the authority to demand an emergency meeting within 12 hours. We sent the formal request. They confirmed. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." Brandon nodded, his gaze sharp as a blade honed to precision. "They will assume this is about negotiation, an apology, a payout. But we are not here for compensation." He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "We are here to change them from the roots." No one spoke at first, but the agreement spread across the room through their eyes. They had followed Brandon for years, and they knew that when he said change, it was not a slogan. It was a storm ready to tear apart whatever had rotted. Orion's chief counsel, Evelyn Carter, a 54-year-old black woman with commanding silver hair, placed a heavy folder in front of Brandon. "These are all the complaints that were buried," she said. Tiana and 3 other attendants provided copies of internal emails. Even Coast Air's HR department attempted to discipline Captain Hale's crew, but upper management dismissed the issue. "Based on the number of violations, we can immediately demand full termination." Brandon turned through each page. Names, dates. Passengers moved out of first class for being not aligned with brand image. Phrases dripping with discrimination, disguised as priority service. Each file was a cut to his belief that fairness still meant something. He paused at one complaint from a young black mother who was removed from first class while traveling with her child because she did not carry the presence of a business professional. A single drop of water fell onto the document from his still damp hair, though no one knew whether it came from the rain outside or tears forced back. "We will finish this," Brandon said quietly. "Not just for me. For everyone they treated like garbage." Alicia stepped toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You are not alone." At that moment, the door swung open. Tiana Brooks entered, clutching a small USB drive. Rain clung to her coat, but her eyes held something Brandon recognized, instantly new evidence. "I found this," Tiana said, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve unmistakable. An internal recording from last month's crew meeting. Evelyn plugged in the USB, and the room filled with the icy arrogance of Captain Martin Hale's voice. "Let me be direct," he said. "First class must maintain its image. We cannot let regular customers feel uncomfortable because of passengers who do not belong. If necessary, reassign seats. If they resist, call the air marshals. Simple." Another voice, Ryan Bishop, the first officer, added, "As long as our paperwork is clean, the company will protect us." They always do. Brandon closed his eyes for 1 second, then 2. When he opened them, the resolve burning inside was no longer a flame, but a rising sun ready to incinerate whatever corruption it touched. "Evelyn, is this recording enough to remove them from the industry immediately?" Evelyn nodded. "More than enough. Not just removal. It could trigger a federal investigation into racial discrimination in public service. This is a fatal blow." But Tiana was not finished. She placed another stack of documents on the table. These are statements from 27 employees across multiple airports, all describing the same pattern of discrimination. Alicia inhaled sharply. My God, this is not personal misconduct. This is systemic culture. Brandon rose from his chair and walked to the glass wall overlooking New York, glowing beneath the rain. The city lights reflected across his face, revealing a fierce mix of sorrow and power. Tomorrow, he said slowly, we make them confront the truth. He turned, sweeping the room with his gaze. This is not about Brandon Mitchell being removed from first class. This is about hundreds, thousands of people who were treated unjustly, and I will stand for them. No one breathed. No one moved. They were witnessing the moment a man transformed pain into a weapon sharper than anything in their arsenal. Suddenly, Brandon's phone vibrated. An email from Gerald Whitmore. Mr. Mitchell, had I known your true status, this misunderstanding would not have happened. I would like to propose a partnership. I have valuable political connections. Brandon shut off the screen immediately. His face flickered with revulsion. Do you want me to reply? Alicia asked. No, Brandon said. Tomorrow they will understand the answer for themselves. He turned back to the table, his voice dropping but booming with force. Prepare the documents. Tomorrow we are not just attending a meeting. Tomorrow we are rewriting the rules. The night stretched well past midnight. They reviewed every piece of evidence drafted, strategy, rehearsed statements, prepared legal angles. Outside, the storm intensified, but the storm inside that conference room was fiercer still. By the time they stepped out, the rain had stopped, yet the air carried something electric, restless, as though the entire city was waiting for morning to witness a reckoning. Brandon lingered at the door, gazing into the empty conference room, the half-drained coffee cups, the stacks of papers marked in bright yellow highlights. He whispered inwardly, Mum, tomorrow I will stand for everyone who cannot. And he knew. Tomorrow would not simply be a meeting. It would be the day an empire was forced to bow before a truth it had buried for years. Tomorrow would be the day the storm rose. And this time, Brandon Mitchell would be its center. The next morning, the New York sky cracked open, with its first pale streaks of light, sunlight slipping through the heavy clouds, as if even the sun was wary of what this day was about to unleash. Brandon Mitchell stepped out of the car, the sharp lines of his black suit wrapping his powerful frame. His face calm, but his eyes carrying a force so commanding that people instinctively moved out of his path. The tower that housed Blue Sky Holdings loomed above them like a fortress of authority. But that authority was nothing more than paint on a crumbling wall, because Brandon was walking in to strip it away, layer by layer. Alicia Monroe walked beside him, an iPad in hand, her eyes sharp after a sleepless night. Brandon, all evidence is arranged chronologically. When needed, I will display each part. Brandon nodded. We will not let them dodge a single question. The glass door slid open, and the legal team, along with 8 senior members of Orion Systems, entered like a battalion, stepping into the greatest battle of their careers. The receptionist jolted slightly when she recognized him. Mr. Mitchell, the boardroom is waiting for you. Brandon did not answer, simply moved toward the elevator where Alicia tapped her badge, and the number 42 glowed. When the doors opened, a thick carpeted hallway led them toward the main boardroom. One moment of silence, a moment stretched tight like a heartbeat on the edge. Then Brandon pushed the door open. Inside, 14 members of the board and executive leadership of Blue Sky were already seated, along with the CEO of the airline, Nathaniel Reeds, an older man with silver hair who tried to maintain a calm exterior while his tapping fingers betrayed his anxiety. Gerald Whitmore was there as well, immaculate in his suit, but the arrogance that once clung to him was gone, replaced by an unease he could not hide. When Brandon entered, the room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. Some attempted polite smiles, others masked defensiveness. But at the far end of the table, 3 faces went pale instantly. Captain Martin Hale, First Officer Ryan Bishop, and Lead Attendant Kelsey Browning, the trio who had forced Brandon out of first class. Brandon let his gaze pass over them, not with anger, not with haste, but with the calm certainty of a man who knew he held every card. CIO Reed stood attempting composure. "Mr. Mitchell, allow me first to offer the deepest apologies on behalf of Blue Sky Holdings." Brandon lifted a hand, stopping him immediately. "We are not beginning with apologies," he said, voice low, steady, and sharp enough to cut the room in half. "We begin with the truth." He took his seat, placing a folder on the table with the weight of someone setting down a verdict. Alicia connected her iPad to the main screen. "I have one question to open with Brandon," said, staring directly at CEO Reeds. "Did anyone in this room know that Captain Hale's crew received more than 20 complaints for discriminatory behavior?" The room shook. Some looked around in confusion. Others lowered their eyes. The 3 at the end of the table, Hale, Bishop, and Kelsey, turned ghostly. CEO Reeds swallowed hard. "I was not informed of that number." Brandon tapped the screen. A list appeared, 23 complaints, with dates, descriptions, and status closed, unfounded. "We also have internal emails," Brandon continued, proving that mid-level managers recommended investigations. Those recommendations were blocked, buried, ignored. Board members murmured. A woman near the front, Helen Morris, the head of ethics, shot up from her seat. "Who approved this? Who closed these files against protocol?" Brandon let his gaze slide to Gerald. "Allow me to help answer." Alicia tapped the screen again. An email appeared from Gerald Whitmore, board member, to HR director. "Subject: passenger complaint. Do not escalate. He is a valued customer. Keep first-class image intact." Gerald's face drained of color. I did not." "No need to explain," Brandon said evenly. "You called white passengers valued. What did you consider passengers of color?" "Burdens." Gerald fell silent. Brandon continued. "Now the direct evidence." He looked toward Tiana, seated behind him with Orion security nearby. Tiana rose her voice, trembling but firm. "I have the recording of Captain Hale's briefing before yesterday's flight. The content shows clear discriminatory intent." The board erupted. Brandon signaled Alicia to play the audio. Hale's voice filled the room, each word, a nail maintain first-class image. Reassign seats if needed. If the passenger is not suitable, move them. If they resist, call the marshals. 1 second of stunned silence. 2 seconds. Then Helen Morris exhaled sharply. "My God, this is a severe violation." But Brandon was not done. He rose, walked toward the end of the table, and faced the 3 who had wronged him. "Miss Browning, do you believe it was right to move a black man to a cramped middle seat while serving champagne to white passengers in front of him?" Kelsey's lips trembled, tears rising not from remorse but fear. Brandon turned to Hale. "Do you understand what you did? You shredded professional ethics. You shredded the dignity of your uniform. You robbed opportunity from hundreds just to satisfy your bias." Then he looked at CEO Reeds. "Now it is time for your company to take responsibility." Alicia displayed the reform proposal, one immediate termination of the entire flight crew involved, 2 termination of all managers who suppressed complaints, 3. Creation of a Passenger Equality Oversight Council. 4. Establishment of a Dignity Office led by Tiana Brooks. 5. Full public release of discrimination statistics within 12 months. Brandon delivered the next words slowly, each one a strike of the gavel. If the board does not approve all items, I, as the largest shareholder, will initiate a federal investigation, launch a class action lawsuit, and withdraw all capital from Blue Sky. I guarantee your stock price will collapse. Thunder cracked silently through the room. CEO Reeds opened his mouth, but no sound came. Gerald nearly sank into his chair. Hale's fists tightened until his knuckles turned white. Then Helen Morris raised her hand, her voice ringing like a judge's decree. I vote in favor of the full proposal. One hand rose, then another, then another. Within 30 seconds, Brandon had an overwhelming majority. CEO Reeds bowed his head. Mr. Mitchell Blue Sky accepts all your demands. Brandon did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply said, "Begin. Today." And in that moment, the entire room, an entire system that once stood above others, was forced to kneel before the truth he carried. The battle was won, but the journey toward true change had only begun. The meeting had ended, yet its aftershocks still trembled through the 42nd floor, lingering like the rumble that remains after an earthquake has quieted. Brandon Mitchell stepped out of that cold conference room, feeling as if time itself had slowed each second heavy, yet charged with a new rising force. The long carpeted hallway leading to the elevator was no longer just a hallway. It had become a passage between two worlds, one where injustice had been carefully concealed and another being reborn through Brandon's actions. Alicia walked beside him, eyes darting across her phone screen. "Media is exploding, Brandon," she said, unable to hide her astonishment. "The news leaked somewhere, the video of you being forced out of first class just passed 2 million views in the last hour." Brandon did not reply immediately. A part of him tasted bitterness, knowing his humiliation was now trending entertainment. But another part understood that this wave of attention was pushing the story into a space where no one could ignore it anymore. As they stepped into the elevator, Brandon's reflection appeared in the steel doors, composed yet burning with an unmistakable resolve. The look of a man who knew this moment was not just his own, but belonged to countless others who had been treated as he was, with no voice to defend themselves. When the elevator doors opened into the grand lobby, they were hit with a storm of camera flashes. Dozens of reporters swarmed around them, microphones thrust forward like an army demanding answers. "Mr. Mitchell, can you confirm Blue Sky has fired the entire flight crew? Do you intend to sue the airline? Have you spoken privately with Mr. Whitmore? Do you consider this systemic racial discrimination?" Brandon raised a hand, signaling silence, and almost impossibly, the chaotic crowd obeyed. He stood tall, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "Yesterday I was removed from a seat I paid for in full, not because of an operational issue, not because of safety, but because of the color of my skin." The words fell like a blade into the silence. Some reporters leaned in as if afraid to miss a single syllable. But this incident, Brandon continued, didn't begin with me. It has happened to dozens of passengers. The evidence we gathered shows systemic racial discrimination, repeatedly hidden by multiple layers of management. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Today marks the end of silence. Cameras clicked relentlessly. A CNN reporter pushed forward. "Mr. Mitchell, did Blue Sky comply with your reform demands?" Brandon did not answer with words at first. He simply pulled the microphone closer and spoke clearly, every single one, without exception. The crowd erupted shouts and breaking news alerts, spreading like wildfire. But Brandon was not finished. He took a breath, his tone slower, yet resonating deeper. I am not standing here to talk only about myself. I am standing here for those without privilege, without a platform, without the power to fight back. No one deserves to be humiliated for simply being who they are. He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze piercing through millions of screens. And I will make sure it never happens again. Alicia touched his arm gently, signaling that they needed to leave before the crowd grew uncontrollable. They slipped out of the media circle and stepped toward the street where an Orion vehicle waited. But as they reached the doors, a small voice called out, "Mr. Mitchell." Brandon turned. Tiana Brooks stood there, clutching a notebook, her face still dotted with raindrops. "I just wanted to say thank you." Brandon walked to her, his expression softening. "No, Tiana," he said. "I should be thanking you. Without you, I would not have known how deep this went." Tiana shook her head, voice trembling. "I only did what was right, but I was scared." Brandon placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice warm, yet unwavering. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite it. You helped change an entire airline, and maybe an entire industry." Tiana wiped her tears and Brandon turned away, though the emotion lingered in his eyes, a blend of pride, gratitude, and heavy responsibility. When he entered the car, his phone erupted with notifications. Federal investigators wanted the full case file. The Department of Transportation demanded a comprehensive incident report. Major law firms offered support, and most notable was a message from an unknown number. "I know I was wrong. Please allow me a chance to speak with you." Signed, Martin Hale. Brandon switched off the screen and leaned back, eyes closing for a brief moment, while his heart continued beating with the rhythm of battle. Alicia looked over. "Are you all right?" Brandon opened his eyes, staring up at the New York sky, beginning to brighten. "Alicia," he said, "everything we have done is only the first step." The car pulled away, leaving behind a tower where power had just been redefined. Ahead of them, a new path was opening, one leading toward real change. Brandon watched the morning light glint across the glass buildings and understood something deeply. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had stayed silent out of fear of being crushed. And from that moment on, that silence was dead. After the press conference that shook the entire aviation industry, Brandon Mitchell returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel, and the 32nd floor instantly transformed into a true command center. Screens displayed Blue Sky's stock. Plunging in real-time, news channels ran non-stop coverage of what they called the largest racial discrimination scandal in Coast Air's history, and social media erupted with millions of comments, most of them supporting Brandon and demanding a broader investigation. Brandon sat down, fingers interlaced, inhaling deeply to steady himself, but the look in his eyes was no longer that of a man humiliated on an airplane. It was the look of someone seeing the full scope of a battle expanding before him. Alicia rushed in with urgency, wrapped in total control. "Brandon, the Department of Transportation wants an emergency meeting with you. They want to hear directly about the evidence and the reform plan." Brandon nodded. "We will cooperate fully." Evelyn Carter, the head of legal, stood behind Alicia, holding a thick folder. "We have an offer from the National Human Rights Federation. They want you as the keynote speaker in the upcoming hearing on racial discrimination in public transportation." Brandon leaned back slightly, eyes lifting toward the ceiling as he weighed the gravity of each new development. He was not seeking fame. He did not want to be a symbol. But no one can stop a flood once a dam has broken. A communications assistant rushed in, breathless. "Brandon, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, streaming a live broadcast. On the screen, Blue Sky CEO Nathaniel Reeds appeared looking drained, but trying to hold on to composure. Blue Sky Holdings commits to working with Mr. Mitchell to fully resolve this issue. We accept full responsibility. Brandon studied Reeds's face, noting the rapid blinking in his eyes, the telltale sign of a man under immense pressure. Brandon felt no satisfaction. Instead, something heavier settled inside him. This was no longer about holding a single company accountable, but the moment when an entire industry would be forced to confront itself. When the tablet went dark, Alicia stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "Brandon, do you realize what is happening? You are opening a door people have tried to open for decades." Brandon looked at her, and for the first time in days, allowed himself a faint smile, not of joy, but of understanding. "If that door is open," he said, "then we walk through it. But we do not stop halfway." At that moment, Brandon's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I want to talk. I have important information. Do not let them blame everything on me." Signed, Ryan Bishop, the first officer. Alicia scanned the message, her eyes sharpening instantly. They are turning on each other already. That means the system is cracking. Brandon considered for a moment. Reply to him. "Tonight. A public location," Evelyn stepped in. "I will accompany you to ensure safety." When the room grew quiet again, Brandon rose and stepped out onto the hotel balcony. Cold wind struck his face, carrying the metallic scent of rain and the endless noise of Manhattan. Far below, traffic flowed like a living river, and the massive digital screens on nearby buildings flashed headlines created by his fight. Brandon rested his hands on the railing, closing his eyes briefly. He thought of his mother, of her words. "You must never bow your head, not just for yourself, but for those who look to you." And now he stood precisely in that position, with millions watching every step he took. Alicia joined him outside. "Brandon, are you afraid?" Brandon opened his eyes and looked out toward the fiery red sunset, cutting through the skyline. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "because I know what we are doing is bigger than anything I imagined. But I am more afraid of what happens if I do nothing." Alicia smiled softly. "Then we keep going." In the room behind them, the communications team continued shaping strategy. The legal team drafted petitions for the Department of Transportation, and on social media, Brandon's story was rapidly becoming a symbol. But for Brandon, this moment was not the peak of power. It was responsibility. A responsibility not only to correct a single airline, but to change how the world understood dignity in service, a right that should have always been fundamental, not a privilege. When he stepped back into the war room, his voice was low, but carried undeniable strength. "Prepare everything. Tomorrow we begin Phase 2. And everyone understood. Their battle was only now entering the heart of the storm. The next morning opened under a pale golden sky, a gentle light carrying an unusual sense of anticipation, as if the entire city were holding its breath for an announcement that might change history. Brandon Mitchell stood quietly before the window of the 32nd floor conference room at the Grand Meridian Hotel, watching the flow of traffic below and feeling the heartbeat of Manhattan moving in rhythm with what he was about to do. Alicia entered and placed a cup of hot coffee in front of him. The Coast Air Board has signed the press release. They officially announced the full reform package. And as you requested, Tiana Brooks will serve as director of the Dignity Office. Brandon took the cup but did not drink. He watched the steam rise and murmured, "Good." But this is only the beginning. A light knock echoed at the door. Evelyn Carter stepped in, her expression carrying both pride and gravity. "Brandon, in the past 8 hours, we have received nearly 800 emails from passengers, airline employees, even pilots from other carriers. All of them sharing cases of subtle discrimination that no one believed before. Now they do." Brandon closed his eyes for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from the ache and release swelling in his chest. "No one should have to write those emails," he said. "But at least now they are no longer alone." Alicia sat beside him, glancing at her tablet as new notifications appeared. "Brandon, here is the update. The Department of Transportation wants you to propose a new passenger rights framework for discriminatory incidents. They want to turn your experience into legal precedent." Brandon rotated his chair, looking straight at her. "If it can protect anyone from what I went through, I will do it." The door opened again. This time it was Tiana Brooks. She no longer carried the trembling uncertainty she once had. Instead, she walked with a new confidence, though her eyes still held the emotion of someone who had been changed forever. Mr. Mitchell Brandon smiled softly. "Call me Brandon now, Tiana. You are no longer a flight attendant who has to be cautious. You are a leader." Tiana pressed her lips together, overwhelmed, then handed him a folder. "I drafted the reform plan for the Dignity Office. I want to begin with listening sessions for passengers who experienced discrimination. No paperwork, no filters, just listening." Brandon nodded, genuinely impressed. "That is exactly why you are the right person to lead this." They were mid-discussion when Brandon's phone rang. The caller ID flashed a name they all recognized, Gerald Whitmore. Alicia raised a brow. "Do you want to take it?" Brandon looked at the screen for a single second, then declined the call. "I know exactly what he wants." Evelyn looked up from her papers. "He has been suspended from the board. Blue Sky is also investigating him for improper intervention in seat assignments." Brandon replied quietly, "Those who sow storms must face storms. I have no interest in him anymore." They resumed their work until another knock sounded at the door. This time, the PR team entered with a spark of excitement. "Brandon, you need to see this. SkyWest Air Frontier and even Metro Air just announced new passenger fairness initiatives based on the standards you proposed yesterday. You started a movement." Brandon stilled for a moment. A memory of his mother surfaced, standing in their small kitchen with oil on her hands after a long shift, telling him, "You do not have to save the world, Brandon, but you can do your part." And he had done his part. Then that part spread like fire through a dry forest. Alicia checked her watch. 30 minutes until the $4.3 billion Homeland Security contract signing. "You still intend to move forward?" Brandon smiled faintly. "Alicia, I built Orion to protect people from technological threats, but this morning I realized protecting their dignity is also my mission. We will sign, and afterward we continue this journey." When they exited the hotel lobby, Brandon noticed a crowd waiting. Some were passengers from the flight, some were airport workers. An elderly woman with silver hair took his hand. "You did what so many of us hoped for, but never dared to try." A young man whispered, "Thank you for speaking for us." A little girl gathered her courage and handed him a small hand-drawn card. "Mr. Brandon is a hero." Brandon knelt to take it, his eyes softening in a way that stripped away the tough CEO exterior, revealing a man who understood that courage often spreads through the smallest, purest gestures. When the car arrived, Alicia opened the door for him, but Brandon paused to look up at the sky, glowing brighter after a long night. "Alicia," he said, "we are not just fixing one airline. We are setting a new standard for how people treat each other." Alicia nodded, conviction shining in her expression. "And you are strong enough to lead that standard." Brandon drew a steady breath, stepped into the car, and as the door closed, the world outside continued shifting in response to what he had set in motion. There were no cheers, no ceremonies, just an ordinary morning in a city that never sleeps. But Brandon knew from today onward, every passenger who steps onto a plane, no matter who they are or where they come from, will carry a right they always deserved from the start, the right to be treated with dignity. And that was the beginning of a new order. From the perspective of an expert in leadership ethics and justice within service environments, the journey of Brandon Mitchell reveals a truth that never grows old. Change does not begin in grand auditoriums or dazzling media campaigns. It begins in the moment a human being is treated unfairly and chooses not to remain silent. What Brandon did was not merely defending his own dignity. He reset the standard for an entire industry, proving that real power does not lie in a first-class seat, but in the ability to protect the dignity of everyone, even when the system tries to extinguish that voice. If this story inspires you, please like the video to help spread the message of fairness and respect. Do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss the next powerful journeys of change. And before you go, comment the phrase "Stand tall" as a reminder that sometimes when one person dares to stand tall, the entire world must shift with them.